Hi everyone, my name's Ishmael Burdeau. I'm a sustainability architect working in DWP, Department for Work and Pensions. So today I'm talking about s- um, digital transformation in government, and I want to talk about how we can possibly count the carbon cost of public services. So just going to give you a bit of background about myself. I've spent 25 years working in architecture and engineering. I think of myself as like a T-shaped person. I don't like that phrase particularly, but I'm not just a techie. I like getting involved in design and user research and some of the business side of things as well. And I've got very high standards with regards to ethics, accuracy, and transparency. So I guess the question I want to look at today is the conference is mostly about sustainability in digital. I'm more interested in sustainability through digital and whether or not digital can be something that improves sustainability or potentially doesn't actually deliver the benefits that it claims to. So I'm going to give you a bit of context about where I work. So I work in DWP, and we're one of the largest government departments. You can see there we've got about around 80,000 staff. That doesn't include another 20 to 30,000 outsourced staff and people who work for our arm's length body. So we're quite a large department, and we serve about 20 million customers across the UK. So the impact we have is big, both in terms of society and delivering people the benefits they need, but also in terms of our carbon footprint. Just going to give you a little bit of another example. So this is some internal documentation that's advisory stuff for the people working in our offices. And you can see that we've printed about 146 million sheets of paper last year with some calculations around the potential emissions around that. So there's always an interest in the volume of printing because that's seen as like a easy metric to look at our impact on the environment. But I think sometimes using just printing can be a little bit naive. So we'll look at that as well. Now, one of the problems that we have in government is, as well as and with any large organization, we have a large legacy estate as well as a front end. And understanding the emissions and the way that those things fit together can be quite a complex process. And the National Audit Office has produced a report on this, the barriers to efficiency in government and addressing the barriers there. And one of the things they recommended is that there's a single owner for the end-to-end service. So at the moment we have multiple different benefit lines, and often there's different parts of the business that will uh, own or take responsibility for how those pieces of the service are delivered. Now my role is part of my role anyway is to report on our emissions to DEFRA, so that's Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And DEFRA has been producing this thing they call the STAR report for over 10 years now. And that stands for Sustainable Technology Advice and Reporting. So the STAR report looks at the emissions created by ICT or digital across government, and we look at things like devices, printing, uh, internet use, network traffic, as well as all our hosting and cloud infrastructure. So it's quite a broad set of figures that we need to collect every year and publish those to the STAR report. But the problem we're facing is that we're looking at trying to reduce our emissions by between 7 and 8% per year, which includes emissions from digital. So it's a very ambitious target, and trying to understand what numbers go into it is also very complex. Just giving a bit of an idea, that's a typical company profile you might see across many businesses. So you can see that scope 3 is estimated to be about 87% of our emissions. And digital is a reasonable chunk of those emissions. And this is from a report done by a consultancy called Kin and Carta, who looked at our current reporting processes. Um, Historically, we've only report on scopes 1 and 2, and we're now looking at reporting more around scope 3, especially with digital services. So DEFRA also publishes in their annual report some information on energy use, CO2 emissions, and the cost of that energy. And you can see that there's potential rebound effects where the energy use is going up or is remaining roughly the same year on year, whereas the carbon emissions are remaining roughly the same, and the cost of energy is going up. So we have a little bit of a crunch situation that we're using more energy, but we're not reducing our carbon emissions at the rate that we need to deliver the net zero targets that we have. I think one of my frustrations, having been an architect and developer for many years, is that I see my role as coming towards the end of the efficiency curve. So if we're designing systems for sustainability, we need to look at the beginning of the curve where there's the decisions made by policy and design. So how we design and conceive of a service can have a much bigger impact on the environmental carbon emissions from that service. As a developer, you're sort of at the bottom of that chain and you're thinking how do we make what's already been decided more efficient, which is important, but I think moving up that curve is where I'd like to see some of the work I'm doing land. So if we think about digital services in government in the UK, we have a very mature front end. We've got a lot of what look like quite slick services on the surface. So if you're making a claim for, in this case, carers allowance, it's not a complex process. It's a fairly simple way to make that claim. And from the user's point of view, you could go away thinking that behind the scenes, it's equally simple and smooth. And if we look at the emissions created by a typical GovUK service, I've run this through one of the carbon calculators for our website, and you can see that our page loads are typically quite light. We perform very well on our UX design, and our carbon scores is very good. So you could go away thinking that there's actually not much to improve there. And GovLogin has recently produced a blog on this topic, and they also pointed out that we've got relatively low page weights and our app sizes are quite small. So there's basically not much to improve looking at just the delivery of the service to the end user. But I think there's a fundamental problem behind the scenes. So for every digital service that we deliver, there's often a lot of back-end manual labor going on, using digital tools, using printers, using Teams calls, sending emails with attachments and so forth. And that stuff is the bulk of our digital footprint in my view. And it's increasingly difficult to understand how we can optimize the services that we deliver if we don't understand the work that goes on under the decks where the people are rowing. And part of the background of the work that I'm proposing has come from initiative taken up by DEFRA. So they're producing what they're calling planet-centered design. So rather than thinking of just user-centric design, which is a core thing of GovUK, they're looking wider to think about the way that our services are conceived, the policies designed around it, and then the way that the services that, or the users that support those services help deliver that outcome. And so I've taken that as some of the principles around what I'm trying to do, and it's given me some ideas to how we can improve the way that we design and measure things. So I'll give you an example, a couple examples of services that we deliver in DWP. One is called cold weather payments. So this is a payment that goes out to people on a low income typically, and the weather must be below a certain range for a certain number of days, and the user will get the payment into their bank account, and then we send them a letter to go with the payment. That comes out about 2 weeks after they've actually been paid. So according to the service designer who I've worked with on this a little bit, we send out approximately 1 million letters in a typical winter. So there's an opportunity there to reduce the emissions by removing that printing option, but we don't really know the best way to transform that. Is it to create a user account where the user can go in and see their details? Should we send them an SMS message? Should we send them an email? Maybe we should just make the payment and not even tell them and wait for them to contact us. So there's a number of different options to consider when transforming winter cold weather payments. But as a product owner, I don't really know what's the best option if I'm thinking about my carbon emissions. And I'll give you another example. So I was recently helping a family member claim access to work. So this is a benefit that's given to people who are in work or have a work offer and they need extra support because of a disability they have. So you can make the claim online through GovUK. It's a very simple process. But once you've made the claim, there's the processing of the claim. And that's still done through a number of legacy tools and manual steps. So in this case, the person who I was working with received 4 documents, which is about just under a megabyte of data, and then 19 pages of printed paper, which they also received, and then some video calls through Teams to sort of talk to the advisor, and then sending things back in the post. So that's another service where we're looking at transforming the way the journey works for the user, but we don't know the best option to transform that. Would it be to create a user account where I can interact directly with a profile I've created? Do we use some sort of AI system to evaluate the claim automatically? Or do we just try and change some of the processes that work at the moment and just maybe optimize those for carbon emissions? So again, it's a decision that the product owner needs to make, not just the cost of running those things, but also the carbon cost. And those are things that are not really understood that well at the moment. Now, we're familiar with things like emission ratings for an oven or refrigerator or some appliances we buy. And I've seen that in France, they now apply these emission stickers to vehicles. So when I drive into a clean air zone, the color of my car sticker will determine whether I pay a fee or not, or a fine. So is there an option to do something similar with a website, but not just the technology on the surface, but the underlying systems that determine all the processes in the back end to deliver that outcome to the citizen? So to do this, what I'm proposing we do in DWP, and this is just very much just my initiative. There's a few other people I'm working with on across government. It's not official policy by any means, but the top 75 services is one of the overall targets for CDDO and for government to identify these top 75 services and then apply a framework to help them all achieve what's called this great standard. I was going to explain what that is a bit. So we have um, services you're probably familiar with, things like applying for a passport, applying for a voter card, managing your driving license, applying for a student loan, and then all the benefit stuff, which is in black. Those are sort of DWP services. These are just a few of the more common ones. You can see pretty quickly that these are quite high profile services that are really behind a lot of the things that we expect from government. So you can find the full list by following that link, but these are a few of the ones I'm looking at the moment to see how we'd apply a great standard to these things, but include a carbon emissions standard on top of the existing standards. So the great standard is part of the 6 missions of CDDO. Mission 1 is to transform public services to achieve the right outcomes. And so this is what the great framework is. Along with Mission 1, we have Mission 4, which is secure, efficient, and sustainable technology, which is a set of goals, but they're not linked directly to the great framework. So I'm looking to see whether we can take Mission 4, some of the principles from Mission 4, and move those into Mission 1, so that for the top 75 services, we're aiming for a level of reporting and goal setting to reduce our emissions across those 75 services. So I'm just going to give you an idea of what's in the great standard. So they're looking for things like digital adoption, digital completion rate, user satisfaction, and there's also cost per transaction. So the cost per, none of these things are new for GovUK. They've been around for some time, including the accessibility standards, but these are all well understood metrics that we're currently recording. And so for the great standard, it's just about setting a baseline for each one and then deciding from that baseline what the target is for that particular service. So if we look at the cost per transaction, now this cost per transaction is something well understood in government. We have the Green Book to advise us on making decisions around how cost effective a particular intervention might be. And you can see from the service manual, we've got some calculations that we use to measure how effective the service is at delivering that particular outcome. So we look at the digital costs, but also what's called assisted digital. So this could be the telephone or paper-based journeys or visits to a job center or a passport office or whatever the extra manual step is. And then we take that total cost and divide it by the number of transactions. So the cost per transaction needs to include all channels. So although there's a push to get things digitized, there's also understanding that not everything can be digitized. And for certain types of interactions, certain types of customers, we may need to continue with a paper-based or a telephone service. But the idea is that by moving to digital, we may or we should reduce the cost. And what I'm looking at is, well, we'll reduce the emissions as well, because that's equally important in my view. This fairly complex slide is taken from the top 75 service guidance, and you can see there's different types of services that we run in government. So we've got very simple things that maybe take a payment, so paying a fine, for example. And there's other much more complex services like requesting or applying for a passport or applying for a benefit, which need to take into account things like identity checks or checks around your living situation or your health conditions. So the more complex services will require a higher cost per transaction because we're expecting there to be some extra technology or more manual intervention by civil servants. And then we also look at the complexity of the service and the volume. So some services may have very low volume and high complexity. So one example might be bereavement support payments, which fortunately have a low level of volume, but there is some complexity around that. So that would be a service that's relatively expensive to run compared to something like collecting a fine or registering your vehicle for car tax. Those are relatively low complexity and a high volume. So they take those two formulas and then they decide a level of success on that, whether it requires improvement, good, or great. And so we look at the scores, the cost of those things. So what I'm proposing that we look at is developing a formula to calculate the cost per transaction. So this is sort of just a brain dump of where I'm at the moment. So it's considering all the scope 3 emissions that go into designing and delivering a service digitally. So it's the web use, the citizen going online using their device to find the service and make the transaction, any travel that might be associated with that transaction, the agent who's processing the claim, the data that's stored, the paper that might be printed, video calls, telephone calls that go with that, email attachments, and then looking at the number of claims we process against that total, and then if there's other things like, for example, artificial intelligence could be something we use to process the claim. We've got a website that's built. We've got the cost of running that service, any legacy technology that's used, and then dividing all that stuff by the number of transactions per year. And the idea is from that, we could build a cost per transaction. So I guess what I'm trying to understand as a conclusion from the presentation is I'm interested in working with others who from government or from the private sector who've tried a similar approach before and deciding if this is just what we need in the industry. We need to be measuring cost per transaction, not just of the digital service, but all the other ancillary stuff. Is this what we're looking for? What's what we need? Is it crazy, unrealistic, naive, impossible? So you've got my email address there if you want to send me your thoughts on this topic. And thanks very much.